Okay, hello chess players. So today we're going to be talking about the King's Indian defense, which begins after d4, knight f6, c4, g6 begins the King's Indian defense. And more specifically today we're going to be taking a look at the Samisch variation, which can begin after the moves knight c3, bishop g7, e4, and we can have either d6 or castles kingside here, but we'll have castles kingside f3 begins the Samisch. So anyways, if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So the Samisch variation is one of the toughest openings to face when you're playing the King's Indian. This and the classical are basically the two main attempts to sort of refute the King's Indian, as it were. White ends up taking up 3 pawns in the middle of the board. If you plug either the Samish variation or the classical into a modern engine, they always give, advantage white. And the positions, you have to be very, very familiar with the theory to play these positions properly with the black pieces. Now, as far as like this early move order goes, Castle's kingside is sort of my recommended move order. Although it's possible to play either one, you can castle kingside and then play d6, or you can play d6 first here. There are some subtle differences in the move orders, though, in terms of options that you have as black. You have some additional options as black if you castle kingside, and there's reasons to play d6 as well. So but anyways, let's talk about some of those options. Like one of the main reasons that people castle kingside is we're trying to sort of repeat this game that was played between Latier and Fischer in Leipzig back in 1960. It was in Fischer's book, My 60 Memorable Games, where Fischer's basically trying to coax white into overextending his center and playing this mistake. He's trying to get white to play the move pawn to e5. So anyways, that game continued 98, f4, d6, bishop e3, c5, and then d takes c5, knight c6. So now Fischer's got more development and his king is safer. And he's starting to sort of break apart the position of white's center. So white's center is actually falling apart. It's overextended and it's falling apart. So the game continued cd6, cd6, knight to e4, bishop f5, knight g3, bishop back to e6, knight f3, queen c7, queen b1, takes f5, e4, takes, f5. And already black has a decisive advantage. The pawn on e6 is not actually a thorn pawn, it's just a pawn that's going to get captured. Fischer's going to play like knight f6, rook e8, rook takes e6. He's going to double and he's going to have a great position. Meanwhile, the white king is still in the middle of the board, and both of white's pieces has absolutely no way to anchor themselves anywhere in the middle of the board, which just gives black a very easy decisive advantage. And Fischer proves it really simply. White has to play f4 to prevent f4, and then we have knight f6, bishop e2, rook f e8. He just takes, he doubles, and then see if you can find the win here. Rook takes e3, winning the game. Rook takes e3, rook takes e3, king takes e3, and pause the video and see if you can find the spectacular sacrifice that wins, and that is queen takes f4, the point being that if king takes f4, we have bishop h6 and mate. So that's sort of the game that people are going for when they castle kingside. It is, of course, also possible to play d6 and forego the possibility of e5. But as I mentioned, after castles and then f3, one thing that you can do here is you have this additional option to play the move pawn to c5 instead of the main line with d6, bishop e3, c5. Now, in both cases, it's possible that all of this is just going to transpose anyway, because when you do play c5, probably the best move is just to play something like d5. You can also respond to bishop e3 with d6 if you want to, and you can transpose into the main line, although again, there's an additional option here that's possible. Um, but a vast number of people are just going to play d5, and you're just going to play d6, and you're going to transpose into this main line anyway. And of course, you can achieve that from this other move order, d6, bishop e3, c5. So the only difference is if you take the d6 and then c5 move order, there is this possibility of dx c5. Now, depending on which line you want to play, like this sacrifice with dx c5, queen d8, bishop c5, knight c6, it's supposed to be okay for black. Theory seems to like it. The position is unclear. We've known about this position for a really long time. The fact that again black has more development than white, black is castled, white isn't. There's weaknesses on the dark squares. c4 can become an especially weak pawn in a lot of cases. It all pretty much compensates for the fact that black is only down one pawn in this position. And I've personally had several games in this position. I've done very well with it, and there's several modern games in this position. So the other choice that you have to make actually looks pretty similar. Like if you play c5 and they play dc5, for example, you're kind of doing a lot of the same stuff. You're going to play a very similar sacrifice, b6 and then bc6, queen b6 is a similar type of idea. You're going after the dark squares, you're going after more development, you're down a pawn. So it's just a question of which one of these sacrifices you want to play. There's quite a bit more theory on the dx c5, queen d8, bishop c5, knight c6 line. There's a lot more theory. This is a lot more tried and tested. This is a lot more proven. So there's a couple of things that White can do here. White can play the mainline move, which is knight d5. I have this pretty current game here. I have Hamilton versus Sharuja played in 2023. That game continued knight d7, bishop e7, knight e7, knight takes e7, check, king f8, knight d5. So this is one of the ways that people sort of try to play this with White. They will basically sacrifice their bishop pair and sacrifice their dark squared bishop in exchange for getting this firm outpost on d5. Of course, they didn't win a pawn in the process because we get the pawn back on b2 right away. Rook b1, bishop back to g7. But they've sort of made the argument, hey, I've got this really powerful knight on d5. But black should have a fairly simple strategy here. Like after knight h3, b6, we can target this pawn on c4, and we've got plenty of outposts for our pieces. There's weak dark squares. The pawn on c4 is weak. We can put our bishop either on b7 just to get it out of the way, or possibly a6 at some point to target that pawn on c4. And in this game, Hamilton versus Firouzja, Firouzja does like all that stuff. We have g4, bishop b7, just to get it out of the way, and then develop the rook to the file, targeting this pawn on c4. And then we have king f2, rook c5, rook hc1. He doubles, just going after that again, going after this weakness on c4. This is the target. Knight f4, so he's securing that outpost on d5. Yay, white has the outpost, but black has an actual strategy, which is good. So we have knight e5 again going after that pawn on c4. And then here, Hamilton made a mistake. He played knight to d3, and this allowed Firouzja to actually have an advantage after rook to c4, and Firouzja did go on to win. But black is already completely equalized. If black played the best move according to the engine, which is g5, black could just play bishop to a6, and we're attacking this pawn with literally everything that can attack the pawn. And then after rook b3, we can just take it, and black is completely equal in this position according to the engine. So that's what to do against the move knight d5. And you might be wondering, well, maybe I don't want to give up the bishop just so that I can keep a firm outpost on d5. Maybe knight d5 isn't the way to go. There are other options, but they do lead to other problems. I've had quite a few games in this position. One game that comes to mind is a game all the way back from 2010 where I was playing against Andrew Tang. And yes, the Grandmaster Andrew Tang. But back in 2010, he wasn't a Grandmaster yet. Actually, in this game, I was the higher rated player. I was a master. He wasn't. He played the move rook d1 against me. Which is actually pretty reasonable. It's one of the many reasonable moves in this position because basically almost any move in this position is reasonable, as it turns out, because it's very hard for white to keep his advantage. So just about everything leads to some form of equality because black still has to fight back to get equality. So he played rook d1, I took. He played king takes d1, and I played knight d7. He played bishop e3. I mean, bishop f2 is also possible. And then I just did court to this really basic positional idea. I took on c3, which basically I give up the bishop pair, but after I take on c3 and he takes back, he's got doubled pawns, and then I'm just going to start targeting the pawns on c4 and c3. So I'm going to play knight to e5, targeting that pawn on c4, preparing bishop e6, b6, knight a5, etc., eventually trying to pick up that pawn. So he doesn't even try to hold it. He just tries to finish his development. He plays knight e2, and then I played knight captures c4, and this is, of course, why bishop f2 earlier would have been a little bit of an improvement, because now I'm gaining a tempo against that poor bishop. He plays bishop f2, and I finish my development with pawn to e5. So now he actually plays pretty well here. We end up with total equality after a whole bunch of moves. He plays knight f4, I bring my knight back to b6. We have knight d5, bishop e6, c4, knight a5. Again, I'm targeting that pawn on c4. King c2, he lets me take it, so now I'm up a pawn. So you'd think this would be, the end of it. Takes, knight c7, rook to d8. He gets his pawn back. Bishop takes here. But I do get to infiltrate. I get to play rook to d2, king to c3, rook a2, knight takes e6, takes, and then of course I have to get my piece back. Now I am up a pawn here, so you would think this would just be advantage black. And I did go on to win because, I was the higher rated player and I'm pressing and I'm up a pawn. But the engine thinks this is just equal. It doesn't think black actually realistically has any way to make progress with best play. But I got kind of lucky and I was able to press in the game. The game continues king b3, king f7, rook c1, b6, g4, rook d7, g5, rook d3 check, king b4, rook takes f3, check, king e8, rook takes h7, rook f4. I'm just desperately trying to get something out of this position. All of this, by the way, is still totally quality according to the engine, and Andrew plays this very, very well, which should have just been evidence that one day he was going to become a grandmaster. Rook g2, rook e7, king f4, and he doesn't make a mistake until he makes a mistake, probably in time pressure. He played rook takes e6. And this allows me to get the win with rook takes g7, rook b6, and then rook d7, and I have a theoretical win. And I did actually go on to win. I completed that theoretical win in the correct way, and then he resigned. Instead of rook e6, he had a draw probably with just king d3. So king f4, he had king d3 was just equality. But anyways, these lines are completely reasonable. Like d6 here, c5, it's totally reasonable to play this way and expect this move. Dx c5, dx c5 takes, knight c6. Black is apparently doing great in these lines. There's tons and tons of theory on it, so there's lots of stuff that you can work with on giving you different ways to go. But if you do play the castle's kingside line and they play f3, you can play a very similar sacrifice with the move pawn to c5. And this does actually cut out a lot of stuff. It cuts out that d6 line, for one thing. If they play bishop e3, you have the option to play, instead of d6, you can play cx d4. I've actually got a couple interesting games here, but the main thing is I would just go with what the computer says to do, which is bishop takes d4, knight c6, bishop e3, then queen a5, queen d2, e6 with the idea of d5. The computer actually recommends this. After rook d1, d5 is supposed to be slight edge black, so I would definitely go with this. This is kind of like the Maroczy Unbound. You're just breaking out in this position with d5, and this is supposed to be advantage black. So just to show sort of further computer analysis, you would have something like cd5, ed5, knight d5, knight d5, takes, bishop takes b2. The point being that you're threatening bishop c3, and after queen takes a5, you have knight takes a5, and the knight is no longer under threat. So here in this position, you have the cleaner pawn structure, you have the bishop pair, your king is out of the center, white's king is in the center, and you actually have a slight edge. I've actually got computer prep that goes further than this, but needless to say, this is actually just slight edge black, apparently, as it turns out. I've got computer prep that goes, really all the way to like move 30 here, just working this all the way out. So dxc5 is a possibility. Other than bishop e3, of course, dxc5 is a possibility you have to be prepared for if you play this line, in which case you should play b6, cb6, queen b6. This is supposed to be unclear. This is not very well explored. So this gives you an opportunity to play something that isn't very well explored. I do have some interesting games that continued queen b3, but then nobody played like the correct move. That's how unexplored this is, which is just to play something like knight c6. Knight c6, queen b6, a b6, bishop e3, and then d6 is an example of what to play. The idea is you're not worried about bishop takes b6 because rook b8. You're going to have an advantage. You're attacking the bishop, and then you're going to be taking that pawn on b2 later. So they would have to play something like knight on g to e2, according to the engine, and then we would continue with knight t7, which holds that pawn. And according to the engine, after knight t7, black is doing fine. But like again, this is just very unexplored territory, but totally worth playing. It's very similar to the other line. You're down a pawn, but white has some weaknesses on the dark squares. He's got a pawn on c4 that you can eventually target, and there's a lot of stuff going on here. But it might not be all that like relevant. If you play the d6 line, we're going to have bishop e3, c5, and really the majority of the people that you play against are going to play d5, and this is where we're going to end up. We're going to end up in this position with d5. You could also have c5 and then d5, and we could end up in this position after d6, bishop e3. We can end up in basically the same spot. So we're probably going to end up here to start the theory, and we're going to end up in some type of Benoni. So we're going to play e6, queen d2, e takes d5, and there's a little bit of like stuff going on here. Like when we play e takes d5, you can see that the bishop is covering that h3 square. And after they play c takes d5, we want to keep this bishop covering the h3 square so they can't play knight to h3, knight back to f2. That's really critical. That basically means that we have two main, or actually three main moves that we can play here as black. We don't want to play knight on b to d7, because then knight h3 to f2 is actually quite strong. Strategically, it's a really good move in this position because at some point they can play f4 where they don't have to worry about knight to g4, and they don't have to worry about overprotecting e4. So that's actually a really big deal. So you don't want to allow that without being able to play bishop takes h3. Now you have two very reasonable options. You can play, they're basically two options. You can play one of two move orders for the rook e8 idea. You can play a6, a4, rook e8, which keeps the bishop on the h3 square. You can also play you can also play just the straight up rook e8 move order. But really, my main recommendation in this video is to play a move like knight to a6. Now, the main reason that I like the move knight a6 is knight a6 is the one move in the position that you can play that absolutely guarantees that you will get play. One of the things that you have to keep in mind is when you play this move, like say a6, a4, rook e8, and they continue with something like knight on g to e2, at some point, in order for black to get play, you're probably going to have to play knight h5 and f5, because they can actually prevent you from playing b5 almost sort of permanently. Whenever you play the Benoni as black, you have to get play. You have to get play somewhere. You have less space. Strategically, you have a much weaker position. The pawn on d6 is weak. It's not as good as white's pawn structure, where he has three pawns in the middle. You don't. You have two. So strategically and positionally you're not doing very well in this position. And the only way to change that is to equalize the position by at some point either playing b5 b4, even if it's a sacrifice, or at some point playing something else equally aggressive, like knight h5 f5. So now in this case, what you end up really having to do is you end up in a lot of lines having to play something equally aggressive, like one of the issues is like after you play knight on b to d7, there are a lot of moves that you have to be prepared for here. The three main moves are highlighted. You have knight d1 with the idea of reorganizing the knights, with that knight coming to f2 and the other knight coming to c3. Another move is knight c1, where white basically takes the idea of playing on the queen side, and of course the other move is knight g3, where white takes up the idea of playing on the king side. So since you have to get play, you have to change the way you play based on which knight move white chooses here, because you just have to get play somewhere. So if white starts playing on the king side, it's probably easier for you to try to play on the queen side. If white starts playing on the queen side, it's probably easier for you to start playing on the king side. So you just have to play on whatever side of the board white lets you play in this position. So for example, like let's say knight g3, you might want to play something like h5, to kind of poke at that knight to begin with. This is why things get kind of confusing, because I know I just said he's playing knight g3 and he's playing on the king side, so you're going to want to play on the queen side, but that doesn't mean we don't throw in h5. So we're kind of playing on both sides of the board. Basically, you have to just be very well prepared when you play the Benoni. So here we have, we're just going to continue with something like, okay, so for example, like h4, the computer actually recommends knight h7, and it gives this insane line. It gives bishop e2, bishop f6, bishop f2, and then it just wants to do this. It wants to go into this insanity and give white this huge attack with the idea of defending everything with like rook e5. And the computer says this all holds together and somehow black doesn't die. So this is supposed to be slight edge black according to the engine. The other way this can happen is like knight g3, h5, they can play bishop e2. This is the much more sort of chill move that I think a lot of people are going to play when they're playing the Samisch with the white pieces. You would still continue with h4, knight back to f1, knight h7, bishop f2, and then you would have to play in the middle, you'd have to play with pawn to f5. This is just something you have to be prepared to do. Notice that this bishop and this knight and this pawn are just effectively preventing d5. So you can't play b5 in this position, so you're just going to have to get some play somewhere. You're going to do it with f5, and according to the engine, you're supposed to be okay here. For example, if white tries to refute the setup, like if white plays e takes f5, you can just play a very aggressive sacrificial continuation. The white king is still in the middle. You can play knight e5, and then say f takes g6. You can play knight g5. You actually have a threat on the f3 square, and it's only because of these active tactical ideas that any of this works. For example, if they fork, if they play f4, you have knight f3, and then you win the queen. Takes. So, these active tactical ideas sort of make your position work, which is just kind of par for the course in the Benoni. So you'd have something like knight e3 instead, and then you would have pawn h3, again going after this idea. Castles, h captures g2, king g2, bishop h3 check, king back, knight on g to f3, bishop f3, knight f3, queen e2, rook f8 is advantage black according to the engine. So this is how you might play against a move like knight g3. You would start with a move like h5. But again, there's all these other options here. There's knight d1, there's knight c1. d1. So, for example, we could have knight d1. I would recommend in this case rook b8, going after b5, knight ec3, queen c7, rook c1, and then queen a5. And we're following Holton versus Ziegler, played in Gothenburg, Sweden back in 1997. The game continued rook b1, knight e5, bishop e2, and then b5. So basically just playing b5, even if it's a sacrifice, is totally okay. In this case, it's not a sacrifice, ab5, ab5. And black is gaining space on the queen side, so as long as he's gaining space somewhere, that's okay. The game actually continued with pawn to b4, and then after c captures b4, according to the engine, this position is slight edge black. After white's next move, after knight a2, black played the move knight c4, and according to the engine, it's already decisive advantage black. So black gained his space on the queen side, he got play, and that's basically what you have to do in these positions. So that's against, the knight d1 move. And again, the last move that's possible is knight c1, and in this case, kind of the line you have to play is knight e5, bishop e2, knight h5 castles, and again, f5 right away is the way that you have to play this. And again, this is tactically justified. They can't play, for example, ef5, gf5, f4, which would be strategically terrifying. You have the knight on h5 hanging and all this other stuff, but white has problems as well, as it turns out. You can just play knight g4 and everything is fine. You're threatening the rook on e3. You're threatening the bishop on e3, and there's this auxiliary threat of bringing the bishop to d4, which would pin the bishop and the queen. This actually makes this position major advantage black already. White doesn't have a great move. He has to take this knight, and then you can simply play f takes g4. And there is this threat on this bishop. So after simply bishop f2, black would play bishop f5. Black has more space. Black has better squares for his pieces. Black has an advantage. So they can't strategically refute the move pawn to f5. That's just really critical. They can't play e takes f5 in either of these cases and just strategically refute it. So they would have to play something else, like f4 is a possibility. You could have I have this game, Mihalovic versus Ko, uh, Kovacevic, played back in 1996. They continued f4, and the position was very unclear. That game continued knight to d7, bishop f5, gf5, e5, d takes e5, with just a very unclear position. Very interesting game. It was probably also possible to play other moves here. Probably knight g4 is possible as well, even in this position. Okay, so that's how you play against knight c1, but again, that isn't the move that I fully recommend here. The move that I put my wholehearted full recommendation behind is knight a6, mostly because it guarantees play. After knight on g to e2, we're going to bring this knight back to c7, and then really white should just play a4 right away. The interesting reason is because you're just threatening to play b5, and you're threatening to play b5 against almost anything when you retreat this knight. So like against knight g3, you can actually just play b5 right away. And this is supposed to be okay. Like b5 right away, knight p5, bishop b5, rook b8, a4, a6, bishop e2, h5. H4, knight g4 is supposed to be it's advantage black, very slight edge according to the engine, and it's a really cool idea. You're going after the pawn on b2, and you're sacrificing a knight to do that. But of course, the white king is still in the middle. So like f g4, rook b2, queen c1, bishop g4, rook b1. You would have queen a5 check, king f2. Rook fb8, rook b2, rook b2. Slight edge black according to the engine. So kind of a cool situation where knight c7 sort of forces a4, in which case you should play a6, and we should be back in the same situation. Now here, white's only real try is to play knight to g3, and then black just needs to follow up with the idea of playing bishop d7 and b5. The reason the other ideas don't work is because black's play on the queen side is just a little too fast and a little too strong. So for example, if knight c1, you would just continue with something like something simple like rook b8, and then if white tries to play on the queen side with rook b1 and b4, you would have something like b5, b4, and then you would have takes, knight fd5 is actually completely winning. It's a very cool tactic. You're threatening the bishop. You're threatening the knight on c3. Your knight on c3, where you can take it with the bishop, and you can actually do this. But also, if this knight on c3 moves, this rook on b1 is hanging. So black has essentially a completely winning position here. And of course, if e captures knight, you simply have bishop captures c3, queen takes c3, and then rook captures b1. You're winning that material, and you have a big material advantage. Even this passed pawn is going to play a role at this point. And black just has a decisive advantage here, and black should be winning. And I've actually won a couple of games like this. So like a6, kind of forces this knight g3 move, and then you're going to have bishop d7, bishop e2, b5 right away, castle's kingside, b takes a4 is supposed to just be unclear. Black has approximate equality. Black has plenty of play on the queen side and should continue to be okay. Just to finish out this computer prep line, it goes knight takes a4. This is all according to the engine. Bishop b5, b4, c takes b4, knight b6, rook b8, bishop b5, knight b5, rook a6, knight c3, knight c4, knight d7, rook takes d6, queen e7, bishop g5, queen back to e8, bishop f4, rook c8, knight b6, rook b6, knight a4, rook b7, bishop c3, queen e3, knight c5 is totally equal according to the engine, even though black is down a pawn. The very extended pass pawn on b4 and the anchored bishop on c3 should yield black a slight advantage in this position. Anyways, that's how you play against the Samisch position. Basically, it's going to turn into a Benoni if you play it correctly. Um, it's a lot of theory, so I know this ended up being a long video. Hopefully, you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Hopefully, you'll learn something new about chess. Thank you very much for watching.